actually, even if we're not eating junk food, but we're on a low-fat diet, if we're following the dietary guidelines, you are just not going to get enough of those fat-soluble vitamins. And this is why they don't work. And people will get sick following these dietary guidelines. And what's interesting is if you follow the dietary guidelines, you actually will not get even the RDA of all the vitamins and minerals. They're just not there. There's a huge disconnect between what the government is telling us about what we need and then the diet they're recommending.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada Gore. This is episode 75, and my guest is Fallon Morell. Sally is a well-known author, speaker, and blogger. She is an expert on the foods that nourish us best, and she is the head of the Weston A Foundation. Today, she gives us invaluable insight on the topic of fats, how much and what kind we should include in our diets. She goes deep explaining the difference between a variety of fats, and she also goes practical, giving us ideas on how to tweak our diet to get the right percentage of fat into our bodies for improved health and energy. Before we dive into the conversation, we want to tell you about something special that we have for you. Just for you listeners, we have a special inside scoop kind of deal. It's the Wise Traditions Starter Kit. It is a bundle of our 3 most popular brochures and resources. The first is a Dietary Principles brochure. Basically, it's a list of the 11 principles that define the Wise Traditions diet. The Healthy for Life booklet gives recipes and a framework for how to eat the Wise Traditions way. And the shopping guide is a 92-page resource that lists brand names of different foods so you can figure out which are good, which are best, and which you should avoid altogether. These 3 resources usually go for about $14, but the podcast listener special means you can get them for just $7. So go to westonaprice.org, go to the podcast page, and click on the star that says Podcast Special. Yep, it's just for you. The Weston A Price Foundation wants you to be able to get a great, solid start on your wellness journey. So check it out. Again, go to westonaprice.org, the podcast page, and click on the podcast special. And now we want to recognize our sponsors. Wise Traditions is supported in part by New Trends Publishing, home of nourishing traditions and other amazing books on diet and health, at newtrendspublishing.com. And Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant. It's the probiotic everyone's talking about. Go to thriveprobiotic.com. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Sally.
Thanks, Hilda. It's nice to be back again.
Well, I know people want to know more about the dietary principles associated with the Wise Traditions diet. So today we're on principle number 7, is that right?
Yes, and that's all about fats because it's such a confusing topic.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, I feel like more and more people are trying to eat healthy fats, but even as you've said before, there can be confusion about what is a healthy fat.
Exactly, and how much fat to eat.
Mm-hmm.
So principle number 7 tries to address this in the simplest way possible. And we do this by starting off with a really confusing statement, which is that the amount of fat in traditional diets varied greatly. Anywhere from 30 to 80% of the calories in the diet came from fats. So 30% of calories from fats is a low-fat diet. I mean, our guidelines say that's a high-fat diet, but it's a low-fat diet. I mean, that's just the absolute minimum from fats. And then we have, on the other extreme, something like the Eskimos. They don't eat carbohydrates, the traditional diet. So they get 80% of their calories from fats.
So these percentages come from the people groups that Dr. Price saw around the world.
Right. And to make things even more confusing, when we talk about percentages, we're talking about percentage of calories. So just to give you an example, a tablespoon of fat is 100 calories. It's very nutrient dense because there's more calories in fat anyway, and there's no water in fat.
Uh-huh.
Whereas a tablespoon of a carbohydrate food would be at most 50 calories. So if you look at your plate and you see some piece of meat with some fat on the meat and maybe some butter on top of the meat, it might just look like a couple of tablespoons of fat and a half a cup of meat. But that could be 50 to 60% of calories is fat.
Oh, it is confusing.
It's very confusing. But let's just say that if you're eating a lot of bacon and butter and not a lot of carbs, you're eating a high-fat diet. And probably your percentage of calories from fat is anywhere from 60 to 80%. Whereas if you are living on a high-carbohydrate diet with not a lot of animal foods in it, lots of grains, potatoes, sweet potatoes, that kind of thing, then probably you're getting 30 to 40% of your calories as fat. So there's a huge range, and I never tell people how much fat to eat because some people get nauseous when they eat a lot of fat. And then there's people like myself who feel terrible if they don't eat a lot of fat.
Uh-huh.
So that's really a very individual thing. But one thing that's pretty consistent is that they weren't getting a lot of their fat calories from polyunsaturates. So they weren't using vegetable oils. Most of our fats should be saturated or monounsaturated, and then just a little bit of those omega-6s and omega-3s.
And the saturated fats are predominantly the animal fats.
Yes, animal fats are predominantly saturated. Now, any fat is a mixture of different types of fat. So, for example, butter is about half of its regular saturated. About 35% is the monounsaturated, the same that's in olive oil. About 10% are the nice short-chain saturated fats like in coconut oil. And then there's about 2% of your polyunsaturates, a combination of omega-6 and omega-3. And that's an ideal combination. And of course, I think your listeners know that in spite of what you hear, the good fats are mainly the saturated fats. We need those polyunsaturates, those omega-6s and omega-3s, but not a lot of them. And if we have too many of either omega-6 or omega-3, we start to get into trouble.
And what kind of trouble would that be?
Okay. Well, actually, Chris Masterjohn has done a really good job of delineating what you might find with too much omega-6 or too much omega-3. With too much omega-6, you're going to get immune function problems, weight gain, things like that. With too much omega-3, you would get things like easy bleeding, tendency to stroke, things like that. So you can have too much of either one.
So how do we find the right balance?
It's really not hard. If you're eating real food and not using all the industrial fats and oils, you don't have to worry about it too much. It kind of works itself out.
I just feel like there are so many mixed messages out there.
There are. I mean, I'm working on a chapter on my next book on the Eskimos. And their diet is extreme because they eat so much fat. And they do eat more of the omega-3s than anybody else in the world. And that was used as a way to sell fish oil. But the omega-3s that those Eskimos are getting are very different from what's in fish oil, because fish oil is highly processed, heated to very high temperatures, whereas the Eskimos are getting their omega-3s raw, mostly raw. And the Eskimos do suffer from some of the diseases that you get with too much omega-3.
Interesting.
They bleed easily. They have nosebleeds very easily. They have bleeding from the umbilical cord when the baby's born. So they do show some of the problems with too much omega-3.
Now I want to go back to the fish oil point, because I feel like the foundation is big on cod liver oil and consider it even a food, not just a supplement. Yeah. But you said there are negative things associated with fish oil. So is there a distinction to be made here?
There absolutely is. So fish oil is really a waste product from the fishing industry. So after they've cut out the fillets, everything else is kind of boiled down. And I guess the solid stuff goes into pet food. And then they have an oil left. And that oil is heated very, very high to kind of purify it, get the smell out. And that oil is not, first of all, it's going to be very rancid, very broken down fats because of the heating, but it's not necessarily a good source of the vitamins we're interested in, which is A and D. Now, cod liver oil, the 3 brands that we recommend, are not heated. The oil is extracted without heat, and the vitamins are completely natural and undamaged. So we do make a big distinction between fish oil, which is basically worthless. It's an industrial product. And cod liver oil, which is a great source of A and D. And because we walk in the footsteps of Weston Price, we know it is really essential to get plenty of these vitamins in our diet.
So going back to the diet thing, Sally, and we were talking about mixed messages, I feel like some people are on the good fat, high fat train, but then there are others who still think it's important to eat a low fat diet. Why is that advice still being touted out there?
Well, we can point to healthy populations that don't eat a lot of fats. And I think the best example is Africa, where there are some groups that are agriculturalists and are not getting a lot of fat in their diet. They're not getting a lot of animal food in their diet. And what I like to point out here is, first of all, the carbohydrates. Your body can turn those carbohydrates into saturated fat. So that's not the problem here. The problem with a low-fat diet is getting enough of the fat-soluble activators, A, D, and K. And in Africa, they do that because they're eating animal foods that are extremely concentrated, but not very acceptable to Westerners. So they're eating things like whole dried fish, shrimp paste, which is a definite acquired taste, but extremely high in vitamin D. And the little fish will be great sources of vitamin A. They eat insects. When they do kill an animal, they eat all the organ meats and the blood. So they don't need the other fats because they're getting those fat-soluble activators, and then they can just turn the carbohydrates into fats.
Oh, I see what you're saying. If we try to go low fat in the United States, because we're not eating those foods, we're eating probably crackers or pretzels and celery, and there's no fat, and there's no way to get these activators.
And actually, even if we're not eating junk food, but we're on a low-fat diet, if we're following the dietary guidelines, you are just not going to get enough of those fat-soluble vitamins. And this is why they don't work. And people get sick following these dietary guidelines. And what's interesting is if you follow the dietary guidelines, you actually will not get even the RDA of all the vitamins and minerals. They're just not there. There's a huge disconnect between what the government is telling us about what we need and then what the diet they're recommending.
I wonder if it's two different departments that are working on this or something. So in other words, the vitamin standard is yay high.
Yeah,
and then the dietary standard, if you follow it, you can't get that high.
Yeah, right. Like, for example, I think it's 3,000 units of vitamin A you're supposed to get per day. Well, where are you going to get that if you're following the dietary guidelines? They say you can get it from all these vegetables you're eating, but most of us convert the carotenes to vitamin A very poorly. And you're not eating butter, you're not eating fats, you're not eating liver, you're not eating meat, no egg yolks. So where are you going to get even the minimal vitamin A that they say we need? And that is the real scandal of these dietary guidelines, because they basically end up with malnutrition. But in a place like Africa, where the dietitians see that they're eating sweet potatoes and they're eating greens and they have all these plant foods, it's all very well and good, but they don't talk about the kind of yucky things they eat, like insects.
Right. Like you said, they're not palatable to us,
and
but they work perfectly for them.
They do, exactly. And, a lot of these economies are quite impoverished. And, when you're hungry, you'll eat anything. And I've walked in the markets in places like Zimbabwe and looked at what people are eating. And, yeah, those little fish are there for sale, and the dried insects are there. And so if you leave those things out of this very nice politically correct diet, you're going to end up with malnutrition.
Wow. Well, so speaking of diets, I watch different dietary trends, and I feel like there's one out there called the ketogenic diet. What do you know about that, Sally? And is that in line with the Wise Traditions diet?
Yeah, now the ketogenic diet is a diet, and I'm not really up on my biochemistry on this, but it's a very high-fat, high-protein diet, and you end up not with glucose, but with these ketone bodies nourishing your brain and everything else. And I do believe there are some problems with this. What's interesting to me is that Eskimo diet was not a ketogenic diet. They were not in ketosis. I don't know if this is because what people are doing here is maybe too high in protein. There is something called protein poisoning, where you eat too much protein. So whether you're on a low-fat or a high-fat diet, the amount of calories from protein really, about 20% is the limit for being healthy. And then so the rest is either going to be carbohydrates or fats or a combination thereof.
Yeah, I used to think that the Wise Traditions diet was high protein until I looked more carefully.
You need protein. You need animal protein. If you're getting plenty of vitamin A, you don't need as much protein because the vitamin A helps you use that protein properly. In traditional diets, the amount of animal protein they're getting, it varies from 10 to 20% of calories. And the rest is carbohydrates and fats. So yes, we need protein, but I do like to stress we are not a high protein diet. And we really warn people about protein powders, skim milk, lean meat, skinless chicken breasts.
Yes.
Really gets my blood boiling. Talk about skinless chicken breasts, which is they're inedible, you know.
So dry.
They're so dry. You have to put some kind of yucky sweet sauce on them. But you eat the chicken with, the skin and the fat, and then it's really delicious.
That's how it was meant to be.
Exactly.
That's in line with Wise Traditions, for sure. People weren't peeling off their chicken skin. Coming up, Sally tells us about the nutrients that are unique to animal fats, and she explains their healing effects on the body. Now we want to pause and thank our sponsors. Have you seen the Nourishing Traditions cookbook for children? It's amazing. The kids and actually your whole family are going to love this spiral-bound, simplified, illustrated version of Nourishing Traditions. You can learn to make everything from crispy nuts to friendly ferments. It's available at bookstores, online booksellers, and of course, at newtrendspublishing.com. And if you decide to go big, keep in mind that case orders are 50% off at newtrendspublishing.com. And Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant. Most probiotic pills just pass through our bodies without achieving the desired effect. Microbiologist Kiran Krishnan, whom I interviewed just a few weeks ago, recommends a spore-based probiotic like Just Thrive Probiotic. If you want to hear Kiran, check out episode 69 entitled Improve Your Microbiome. Just Thrive is the first 100% spore-forming probiotic that arrives alive in the intestines naturally. It supports optimal gut health, digestive health, immune health, and delivers antioxidants. It's great for adults, kids, the whole family. The probiotic everyone's talking about. Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant. Visit their website at thriveprobiotic.com. So, Sally, what's the percentage of fat that you eat? Just because we like to imitate you.
Well, I actually did analyze it once, and it was about 70% of my diet is fat. And to me, that's how I survive. When I was growing up, I had a lot of health problems that were mainly hypoglycemia. I'd get grumpy, I'd get allergies. I'd feel faint. I used to faint all the time when I was a child.
Wow.
And also, a couple of times I actually kind of went blind. I couldn't see. And this is all blood sugar problems and vitamin A problems. When I discovered that if I just would increase the amount of fat in my diet, all of those problems went away. And I never felt hungry between meals. I just need 2 or 3 tablespoons of butter at every meal, and then I'm fine. And it doesn't sound like much, but that butter really adds to the calories that you're eating.
I see. And there's a reason these fats are so nourishing, isn't there?
Can
you tell us what they're vehicles of? What do they give to our
Okay,
bodies?
so the an animal fat, especially a fat like butter or egg yolks, first of all, you've got the fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, and hopefully also vitamin K. And those are the really critical fat-soluble vitamins that Dr. Price talked about that were so high in traditional diets. And this is why we stress the grass feeding, because they'll be higher in the grass-fed animals. Vitamin E is another one that you get in its most natural form in animal fats. Vitamin E is a fertility vitamin, and it protects you against cancer. So you get those key vitamins. You get lots of minerals from the animal fats. People don't think of animal fats as a source of minerals, but they're in the fat globule membrane. And minerals like selenium, magnesium, these are 2 that tend to be very deficient in the diet. Another surprising mineral in animal fats is iodine, which is for the thyroid gland, of course. And then you have all sorts of really interesting fatty acids. Now, the one that I'm kind of fixated on is arachidonic acid. And I guess the reason I'm fixated on it is because so many people have told us that that's one of the bad ones, that it causes inflammation. But arachidonic acid is an omega-6 fatty acid, one of these longer ones, just like DHA is a longer omega-3. The arachidonic acid is a long omega-6. And thanks to Chris Masterjohn, we know that the many important roles that this plays. Arachidonic acid is very important for our brains. 11% of the brain is arachidonic acid.
Wow.
And also arachidonic acid helps us have tight cell-to-cell junctions. So that means in your skin, the arachidonic acid gives you really good, strong, sturdy skin, not very prone to wrinkles. And then in our guts, the arachidonic acid helps prevent a leaky gut. So, the arachidonic acid molecule looks like a hairpin. It's kind of bent over.
Uh-huh.
And so I think of it as these little pins holding our cells together.
Ooh.
But where do we get arachidonic acid? We get it uniquely from animal fats. It's not in the vegetable oils. It's not in the plant kingdom, really. It's in the animal fats and also in organ meats. So it's very important for us to have these fats. Well, you can't get your arachidonic acid anywhere else.
We're going to put a link in our show notes to Chris's article so people can reference that.
Yes. That article is called Precious Yet Perilous. A fascinating article that he wrote. I think he wrote the wonderful article on the trail of the activator X. And then that one, Precious Yet Perilous. I think those are the two most important articles that Chris wrote.
Ooh, maybe we'll put those both in the show notes.
Yes.
So you were saying there's no other place we can get those. Interestingly, I think Dr. Price thought he would find people who were vegetarians.
He had hoped to find healthy people who were not eating any animal foods. Mm-hmm. And he had to admit that he didn't find these people. In fact, they went to great trouble and risk and expenditure of energy to get the animal foods. And, if they couldn't get large animals, they ate insects, they ate termites, they ate rats, little birds. They did everything they could to get the animal foods.
Now, I know there are two saturated fats that are not related to animals. That is the palm oil and the coconut oil. Is that correct?
Those are saturated plant oils, the main two. And the reason they're saturated is because in the tropics, you need things to be more saturated or the leaves would be floppy. They would just be wilted. So in a warm climate, you need more saturated fat. And what are our bodies? Our bodies are tropical. We're 98 degrees. We're very warm. A cow is 101 degrees. That's why her fat is so saturated. And even though she's eating plants all day long, she makes all this saturated fat because we as warm-blooded animals need that saturated fat or our cells would be just kind of limp. And you would get leaky gut and wrinkly skin and all of that.
And you were mentioning earlier about iodine, how that's important for thyroid function.
Yes.
I just want to interject here. I feel like I know a lot of people who are suffering with thyroid issues. And maybe this is one reason why they're not including these animal fats in their diet.
Oh, I think so. And in fact, butter is the ideal food for the thyroid gland. There's 3 really important thyroid nutrients in butter. One is iodine. Now, especially if the cows are being fed kelp or they're getting their udders wiped down with iodine. So that's a good question to ask your farmer.
Okay.
And secondly is vitamin A. Your thyroid gland cannot function without vitamin A. You can't make any thyroid hormones without vitamin A. And third is a special fat called butyric acid, which is unique to butter. And it helps the receptors in your thyroid gland. So the receptors for T3 and T4 and in your cells also. So this combination of iodine, vitamin A, and butyric acid in butter makes it the ideal food for the thyroid gland. And what have we seen as people have abandoned butter? We've seen this epidemic of thyroid problems, and it's considered 1 person in 2 in this country has some sort of thyroid malfunction. Might not be overt thyroid disease, but something that's not quite right in thyroid function.
Well, I went for this thermography exam recently, and I think when I went 4 years ago, they said, oh, your thyroid. They said, it doesn't look like it's bad, but it looks like there could be an issue in the future. And this time I went, there was nothing.
Sailed through, yes.
And I love my butter.
I also think that they are operating too frequently on the thyroid gland. A lot of the things they take your thyroid gland out for are not that serious, and you can live with them. So I think anyone who has been given the diagnosis of thyroid tumor or malfunctioning of thyroid gland, before you have it removed, you need to get a second opinion.
Wow, excellent advice. Well, I also wanted to interject the story of a friend I met recently, Elizabeth. She said that the Wise Traditions diet saved her life.
We love those stories.
It's a great story. She had eczema all over her body so bad, Sally, that when she turned her neck, it would crack and bleed.
Oh,
that's how bad it was. But she went to the dentist. He said she needed a root canal. She started looking around and she found the Weston A. Price Foundation. She upped her fats, her broth intake, all these things we've been talking about, and now her skin is smooth. Now she didn't need the root canal. Like, she's doing amazingly well.
I love stories like that. And, the skin problems are the hardest to get rid of, I think. But again, the animal fats are so important for the skin. The vitamin A, the arachidonic acid, just the saturated fat itself is critical for healthy skin function.
So as we start to wrap up, would you say that people should just play around with the level of fat that they include in their diet, or how should they go about figuring out what's best for them?
I would try to increase the level of fat in your diet because most people in the West do need more fat. Most of our ancestors came from milk-drinking people. Even African Americans came from milk-drinking people where they got a lot of butter fat. We come from meat-eating people, egg-eating people. So our traditional diet was fairly high in fat. Now, if you're having trouble digesting that fat, two things I would recommend. The first one will really surprise you. One is to eat more salt so that the protein that comes with that fat you can digest. You need salt to digest protein. And secondly, you might want to try some kind of digestive aid like Swedish bitters or even a ox bile tablet to help you increase your fat content. And then I would just see how you feel. If you're doing better, if something clears up because you're getting more good fats, then you know that you've gone in the right direction.
Fantastic. So as we wrap up, I often ask the guest, if the listener could do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend they do?
Eat butter. I just can't stress that enough. Butter is the world's healthiest fat, and the substitutes for butter are probably the world's most unhealthy fats. So throw out your spreads, your tub margarines, your margarines, throw out the cooking oils, and just use butter. And I can promise that just that one thing, if you don't do anything else, just that one thing will improve your health. And probably one of the things you'll notice is you don't need to eat so much because your food will be so much more satisfying.
True. Thanks for your time, Sally.
Thank you. Just go home and have some butter.
I will. My guest today was Sally Fallon Morell, the head of the Weston A. Price Foundation. Check out her blog at nourishingtraditions.com. And for highlights from the conversation today, the links to the Chris Masterjohn article Sally mentioned, and more, go to the show notes for this episode, number 75, on the podcast page of the westonaprice.org website. Hey, and a big thanks to intern Olivia Stamforth for her help with this week's show notes, and to Sarah Fernandez from Podcast Village for her editing assistance. Thanks, guys. Hey, and if you're still listening, the show is at about 80 reviews on iTunes. Can you help us make it to 100? It would be so awesome to hit that milestone. We know thousands of you are listening. Could you do us that favor? We'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Have you been enjoying these podcasts? Have you benefited from them or from the resources on the website or local chapter meetings? If so, please become a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation. It's only $25 for students and seniors and $40 for a general membership. Your contribution is critical for the continued work of the foundation. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.